Good evening and welcome to Viking.TV. My name is Dr. Sue Brunning and I'm curator of the European Early Medieval collections at the British Museum. And tonight I'm here to present a short film that we made at the British Museum, which presents one of our most iconic objects. Indeed, it's one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of all time, and that is the quite fantastic Sutton Hoo helmet. Now, during the course of the video that's coming up, you're going to be treated to a really unparalleled close-up view of the Sutton Hoo helmet. And that's because we had the really rather vanishingly rare opportunity to get up close to the helmet with our cameras while it was being filmed outside of the display case, which is something that, as you'll see from the video, really hardly ever happens. So after the video, in about 20 minutes time or so, I'll be back to answer your questions. So please do ask them, enter them into the boxes there, and I'm going to get through as many of them as I possibly can. So please enjoy the video. I'm Dr. Sue Brunning. I'm the curator of the European Early Medieval Insular Collection at the British Museum, and this is my corner. Welcome to a very special edition of Curator's Corner. Myself and my colleagues behind the camera have all stayed after hours at the museum in order to hold an audience with one of the most famous archaeological discoveries ever made, and it is, of course, the amazing Sutton Hoo helmet. The helmet takes its name from the site in Suffolk, eastern England, where it was discovered in 1939 as part of an amazing ship burial, a 27-metre-long ship that was buried beneath a huge earth mound. And this burial took place in the early 7th century, so we're talking about the Anglo-Saxon period in England. And the helmet was one of an array of grave goods that was laid out inside that ship, things like gold and garnet metalwork, illustrious feasting equipment, drinking horns, silver from the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course an array of glittering war gear, of which the helmet was the key piece. There are only about 4 complete metal helmets that survive from this period. Otherwise, we only really have fragments of others, and this one is the most elaborate. But I think another reason why it is the favourite object from the ship burial is simply because it has this amazing human face. And I think that for a period of time, 1,500 years ago, and for people that can seem quite remote from us, this helmet, this human face, gives us a kind of a relatable way into that period. And so what I thought we would do with the helmet today is we would try to get inside the helmet, try to look out through the helmet's eyes at that world around the people that were wearing and using and encountering this helmet. And I think that would be a really fun thing for us to do together tonight, because I think that even though this helmet has this rather inscrutable expression, it really has an awful lot to tell us. The first thing I thought I'd do is actually explain to you a little bit about what you're actually seeing here, because it's not potentially as simple as you might expect. So what we have here is a reconstruction of the helmet that was made in the early 1970s by a conservator here at the British Museum called Nigel Williams. And it was actually something that took a year of his life. And the reason that it was so difficult is because the helmet was discovered in hundreds of fragments. And that's because the burial chamber at Sutton Hoo collapsed at some point and shattered the helmet into all of these fragments and kind of created the world's most difficult jigsaw puzzle. And the way that he pieced this together was by matching curvature of those fragments and the thickness of them and finding joins here and there whenever he could to create the kind of piecemeal approach to the helmet and actually pinning those pieces onto a plasticine head. And the amazing thing to think about is that he didn't actually really know what the end product should really look like very much, because it's something that is as rare as I mentioned earlier. And so by all of that piecemeal work, he actually managed to create the helmet eventually and piece it all back together into this amazing thing that you can see in front of you now. And what we have here is a blend of original and of modern pieces. So these lumpy parts that you can see all around here, and the facial fittings, everything that you can see down here, those are the original parts of the helmet, and the smooth parts that are interspersed here, those are the modern reconstructed parts. And that's made from a very heavy-duty jute textile that's covered with plaster, and the whole thing has been painted this brown colour so that it matches the corroded colour of the iron pieces. Now, you might be wondering, why would we use such a fragile material in order to create this reconstruction? And the reason is to make it reversible. So if we decided in the future, based on new research, that the reconstruction was no longer as accurate as we would like it to be, we can actually take the whole helmet apart without damaging those fragments and start again. And in actual fact, that has been done one time before. So this is the second reconstruction of the helmet. The first one was undertaken in the 1940s by a conservator called Herbert Marion. But unfortunately, that reconstruction was thought to be inaccurate, and so the whole thing ended up going back to the drawing board. Now we can take a slightly closer look at the helmet itself. So this is the domed skull cap of the helmet, and we think this may have been made in a single piece because the conservators were not able to find the telltale joins that suggested that the helmet may have been made in segments like other helmets of this type. At the back behind me, we have the sloping neck guard that protected the back of the neck. On each side, we have the cheek pieces, which protected the cheeks, and they're on hinges, so they were able to move around. Over the top of the helmet, we have this amazing iron crest, which is actually in the form of a two-headed snake. There's one head at the back here, staring at me, and then another head at the front here. Now, the form of this helmet is really interesting because its closest parallels do not actually come from England. They come from a part of eastern Sweden known as Uppland, which is kind of up to the northeast of Stockholm. There's a place there, two places called Vendel and Valsgärde, where other boat burials have been found, a bit similar to what we find at Sutton Hoo. And inside those burials, we also find other equipment that looks a bit like some of the finds at Sutton Hoo. So there appears to be some kind of connection between this part of eastern England, where Sutton Hoo is, and this part of eastern Sweden. But the reason that the helmets are quite interesting is because their form, their shape, actually looks as if it's based upon late Roman types of helmet. And one of the theories about that is that Northern European mercenaries who were fighting in the late Roman army brought back this equipment, or the idea of this equipment, to their homes when they returned after fighting, and then locally made versions were made. There's also a Roman flavour to some of the imagery that we find on the helmet. Now, obviously, as you can see, it's very fragmentary, but originally we have to imagine that the entire surface of the original helmet was covered in rectangular and square and sort of oblong plaques that were all completely covered with repoussé or pressed imagery, covered the entire helmet. It was absolutely dense with this imagery. Some of the images showed human beings and other images showed animals. We have a wonderful replica actually in the gallery at the museum that you can come and see a little bit about what it would have actually looked like in its heyday, but I still think it's pretty magnificent. But one of the scenes on the helmet, this one that has a Roman flavour, shows a mounted warrior trampling over his enemy, crushed beneath his horse's hooves, and the enemy is just dealing a bit of a parting shot by sticking his sword into the horse's breast. And at the back of the horse, sort of perched on its rump, there's a mysterious third small figure, human figure, that's grasping onto the horseman's spear and appears to be controlling it in some way. Now, this imagery of the horseman trampling his foe seems to have Roman roots. We find it in Roman art. But this Northern European version that we find at Sutton Hoo and in those areas of Sweden which I mentioned seem to have added a couple of details. So that detail of the enemy doing the parting shot, sticking the sword into the horse, and that curious third figure perched at the back of the horse and guiding the spear. The meaning of it is not exactly clear, but it appears that those changes may have been made to make that particular scene more relevant to the Northern European, non-Roman people that were consuming it. And it's very interesting because it makes a kind of unambiguous imagery of victory into something a little bit more ambiguous. Both of those warriors, the rider and the person that's being trampled, appear to be experiencing both victory and defeat at the same time. Another image on the helmet is a little bit more curious. It shows two human beings standing side by side, carrying a sword and a pair of spears and the most fabulous headgear. It's kind of like this horned piece of headdress or something like that, and each horn ends in two fierce birds of prey heads. Now, we don't really know what these people are representing, but we do know that they turn up in the art not just at Sutton Hoo, but in other parts of northern and northwestern Europe as well. Some people interpret it as some kind of ritual performance. The men are not kind of facing each other as if they're warring with each other. They're standing side by side and their legs are kicking out, so they appear to be moving. Some people have seen this perhaps as some kind of ritual dance that's connected with traditional, that is, pre-Christian beliefs and cultural practice. We really don't know for certain, I'm afraid. It's one of those enduring mysteries. But I think that what we can see with this imagery, based on what we've looked at just now, is that we can see the imagery is showing us these connections between the past and the present, between different regions and cultures, different times. The helmet is not just home to a lot of strange human beings, it's also a veritable menagerie of creatures. There are so many animals that are kind of depicted all over this helmet. There's lots of interlacing creatures on some of the other panels covering the body of the helmet, but the thing I really want to talk to you about today is these facial fittings and this great crest that's running over the top of the helmet. So this crest is a functional piece. It's made of iron, it's very solid, it would have been able to deflect any blows, but it's actually also a great serpent. So you'll be able to see at the front here the serpent's head, and it has two of these heads. There's also one at the back that's kind of staring at me right now. It's a little bit disconcerting. So we have this strange two-headed creature, not really like anything that you find in nature, with these staring eyes made from two garnets. And then there are also three other creatures on the front of the helmet. They take a little bit of puzzling in order to see them. If I invite you to look at the human face, the more you look at it, the more you might begin to see that actually it's not just a human face, it's a flying creature. So we can see the head of the creature here coming up to meet the crest of that snake coming down. Then those eyebrows actually become the creature's wings, the nose becomes its body, and the little curved moustache becomes its tail. And what we're left with is this flying creature that's soaring up the front of the helmet. And each one of its wings is lined with these red garnets, so it's almost as if those wings are flaming away there. But at the ends of each one of those eyebrows, we also have boar's heads with these sharp tusks. Very strange. But boars appear to have some kind of special connection with helmets during this period. So two of the other helmets that we have that survive from this period are also emblazoned with boar motifs. And the famous early medieval poem Beowulf also describes helmets that are emblazoned with boars, and those helmets are impenetrable because of those boar motifs. Now, if you're able to come around the side of the helmet here and look at the sides of the dragon-like creature and the snake that's coming down the centre of the crest here, you'll actually be able to see that they're not just passively meeting noses and having kind of like a quite nice conversation. They've not just been laid there. The sides of their faces are full of teeth, so they're baring their teeth as if they're almost ready to tear each other apart. And what we have here are a set of creatures that are predators. They're very difficult to deal with. You wouldn't really want to cross them. They have these very strong, aggressive qualities. These qualities, actually, that any leader of this period would have aspired to. And by wearing a helmet like this that is covered with this aggressive imagery, he's really saying,
I am like the dragon, I am like the snake. Cross me at your peril.
So I'd like us to return briefly to the eyebrows of the helmet because they contain another surprise. Each one of the eyebrows is lined with red garnets, and they're a semi-precious gemstone that was very popular in high-status metalwork of this period. Now, normally each one of these garnets would be backed with a gold foil, and the reason for that would be that the light would shine into the garnet, it would catch on that gold foil, and then it would reflect back out and glow red. I think the best example that I've heard is of a bike reflector. Now, you may remember in my previous video about the Sutton Hoo sword hilt, we spoke a little bit about those kinds of effects and the use of those garnets and those gold foils, and it's a similar effect that we're finding with the helmet here. But there's something strange going on with the eyebrows of this helmet. The garnets on the proper right side, this eyebrow here, those garnets all have those foils behind them, but the ones on the left side here, they don't have those foils. So in practice, generally, what that would mean is that the right side would have been a bit more glittery, a bit more glowy in certain scenarios, such as possibly the flickering firelight of the mead hall, and this side, where the foils are not present, would have been left in darkness. So, in other words, the helmet may have appeared as if it was one-eyed. Would this be something that was just the result of a repair, or could it have been something that was a little bit more deliberate? Well, a really interesting paper was written in the last few years by a couple of experts called Paul Mortimer and Neil Price, and they argued that this was actually deliberate. And their point was that what we might be looking at here is a reference to the early god Woden, who's better known by his Scandinavian name of Odin. Now, in Norse mythology, Odin, quite famously, gave up one of his eyes in order to gain wisdom, and that one-eyedness then became one of his defining attributes, and it's something actually that's lasted down to the present day. So that's why in the Marvel movies, in those Thor movies, Odin actually has an eye patch. So what we might be seeing here is an attempt to connect the wearer of the helmet with Woden, so possibly to invoke Woden's protection, to absorb Woden's particular strength, maybe even at the extreme, to even describe or show the wearer of the helmet is actually like or becoming Woden himself. These sorts of ideas start to lead us away from the physical aspects of the helmet towards more sensory considerations about what it was actually like to wear this helmet. Now, we estimate that it probably weighed about 2.5 kilograms, so it was pretty heavy. It was, literally heavy wears the crown. It's something that you had to bear on top of your head. You would never forget that you were wearing it. But also, we can see that the helmet is completely enclosed. So we have all of these guards surrounding the head, and that actually would have affected and altered all of your senses. So your sense of vision, your hearing, your sense of smell, even your voice may have been altered by the very wearing of the helmet. I think that everything may have been slightly muffled, slightly dreamlike almost. And that makes me wonder whether it kind of put the wearer into a slightly different mental state, whether you felt like you were transformed, whether you felt like you were kind of transported into another world or were becoming another being. You were not yourself when you were wearing this helmet. And I think those kinds of ideas are just really fascinating. And if we flip that over, we can also think about what it was like to actually encounter this helmet. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm fairly intimidated sitting here looking at this thing. It's got such a huge presence. And particularly if we think about the fact that these metal helmets at the time may have been quite rare, so it wouldn't have been every day that you would see somebody wearing something like this. And we can also imagine this person wearing the coat of mail armour that was also found in the burial, carrying that huge shield which itself was covered with lots of metal, wielding the huge sword that I spoke about in the previous episode of Curator's Corner. So this person is completely covered in metal, wielding metal. They would almost have looked like they were no longer a human being that was made of flesh and blood. It's like they're made of metal, like they're some kind of impenetrable super being. And I think that those kinds of ideas also added an extra power to this helmet. This has a bearing on what's probably the most common question that I'm asked about the helmet, and that is, could this thing ever have been worn in battle? Well, you probably won't be surprised to know that we don't actually know the answer, but we can weigh up the probabilities, so let's do that together. One of the theories is that the helmet is far too ornate in order to have ever been used in battle. Surely this was some kind of parade helmet. But really, I think that that's our value judgment. We might not necessarily be prepared to risk something like this and damaging it in battle. That doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't. They had different priorities, different ideas, different concerns, different ways of thinking about things. And so that might have led them to use this helmet in a different way than we ourselves might be prepared to use it. This is a time when this kind of display, this kind of imagery is actually really important, really powerful, and not all of those battles are actually fought on the battlefield. So sadly, that's almost all the time that we have to spend with this wonderful helmet. Believe it or not, this is only the second time that I've ever seen the helmet outside of its display case in more than 10 years working at the British Museum. So really, this is kind of like a once-in-a-decade experience that we've been sharing. So thank you for spending this time with me and with this wonderful helmet. And I hope that after everything we've looked at in this episode, we can start to put the person actually back inside the helmet, and maybe we can start to see a pair of eyes staring at us through those black voids in the face mask there, and we can start to really see a personality start to emerge on that very inscrutable face. If you've enjoyed my corner, then please check out the 2 other Curator's Corners I've done, one about Anglo-Saxon swords and one about the Sutton Hoo sword specifically, plus lots of other corners that have been created by my colleagues here at the British Museum. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all of those things. Oh, and thank you very much for giving a name to my wonderful foam sword. So, behold, Flexcalibur. Hello, welcome back everybody, and I really hope you enjoyed the video. It was great fun to film it actually, as well as slightly intimidating because it's quite an artifact, and as I explained in the video, it's so rare that it comes off display that I was certainly very nervous about spending that time with it, and very aware of where my hands were and making sure that I wasn't going to knock anything, but it was really fun to film. So thank you for sending in some of your questions, and you can continue to send questions in, so please do if you have any that occur to you now that you've seen the whole video. And I'm going to kick off with Charlotte from Cambridge, and she's asked, can you tell us more about the helmet, how the helmet was used? And she says, I imagine it must have been incredibly heavy to actually wear. Is it thought that it was worn as armour during the battle? So I did mention a little bit about that in the video, and just to kind of repeat, in case you didn't pick up on the answer in the video, the answer is we don't really know the answer, which is slightly frustrating. But I think that just based on the type of society that we're talking about, this very martial society where warriors are very important, and martial strength is very important to your ability to hold power. Those status symbols, those symbols of military status, such as the helmet and the other things that were in the burial as well, such as the mail coat, the weaponry, the glittering weaponry, all of those things were very important in terms of portraying your strength and your martial ability and your ability to hold on to power. So I do think that it's not out of the question that these things were worn on the battlefield, as I mentioned in the video. So I just wanted to repeat that one. So next question is from Susan, good name, in Houston, United States. And she's asked, can you tell us a bit about what else was found with the helmet? I know there was a buried ship, but I don't know much about the other artifacts at Sutton Hoo. So yeah, of course, the video is focusing on the helmet, but that's just one of the many things that were buried inside the ship at Sutton Hoo. So we had an array of, as I've mentioned, glittering war gear. You see a glimpse of the pommel from the sword that was found in the burial. That's a really wonderful pattern welded iron blade that was mounted with gold and garnet fittings on the handle, and an extraordinary suite of gold and garnet fittings that were arrayed around the belt that held the sword at the person's waist. There's also, as I've mentioned, a coat of mail armour, which is unique for this period, made up of hundreds and hundreds of tiny interlinking rings, a bit like chainmail that you will have been familiar with from later periods, probably coming down to the sort of the mid arm and the upper thigh, that kind of length. So a proper mail coat of armour, really amazing workmanship. There was also a suite of feasting equipment, so enormous drinking horns that are mounted with silver gilded fittings, lots of drinking cups of different sizes, similarly mounted with these decorative fittings, a really beautiful iron lamp that was found still with the beeswax fuel inside of it. And these are the kinds of objects that conjure up that image of the great hall, the mead hall, where this person would have held court and would have feasted their retainers and people that come to visit, and actually really held power in that kind of hall as well. These sorts of soaring structures that you might see in things like Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, and that kind of idea that these things are based on. But also a suite of silver vessels that have come all the way from the Eastern Mediterranean. They're probably not travelled by trade, so we shouldn't imagine these coming from some of these have come from Istanbul, modern day Istanbul, in those days known as Constantinople. So we shouldn't imagine necessarily a ship going to Constantinople, loading up with the silver and then sailing through the Mediterranean and coming to Suffolk in eastern England. These are the sorts of things that have probably exchanged hands via a network of gift exchange between rulers at the highest level. So we know that the Byzantine emperors were in touch with the rulers of the Frankish Empire, so sort of modern day France and Germany, and they were in touch with England. So it's probably travelling via these kinds of exchanges along that kind of network to reach eastern England.
where it ended up in the ground, and would have looked very exotic in the context of that time as well, because they're not using those types of vessels for their feasting. They're using the drinking horns and those sorts of wooden cups, that sort of thing as well. And other things as well that have come from even further afield. So we know that the garnets most probably came from India or Sri Lanka, but also a fairly recent piece of work was undertaken by scientists at the British Museum on these black lumps that were found inside the ship. And they were thought originally to be some kind of tar that was possibly used for waterproofing the inside of the ship. But what they actually discovered, they were chunks of bitumen, and probably bitumen objects that had come all the way from Syria. Based on the chemical analysis that was undertaken, they were able to trace the provenance of those items from Syria. So really, we've got a ship that's packed not only with treasures, but also with lots of other types of artifacts that have come from all over the world as it was known to them. So it really is literally a treasure trove. So let's go for another question. This is a really interesting one, actually. This one is from Fred from Portsmouth, and he has said, the Sutton Hoo finds are so fascinating. Do you think that all the items found belong to the same person? And other than the helmet, which are the other most interesting objects in your opinion? Well, to take the first part of that question, do we think that all of the items belong to the same person? That's a great question. It's a little bit difficult to answer, but we can get some clues from the objects in the burial. So what we can see is that some of the objects, including actually probably the helmet, were quite old when they went into the ground. So if the person who was buried at Sutton Hoo owned them at the time that they were buried, then they were certainly not the first owner. This is probably some kind of heirloom that's been passed down over generations, and for whatever reason was decided that at the point that this person was buried at Sutton Hoo, that those things would actually go into the ground rather than being passed on. So lots of these objects in the burials seem to have had multiple owners, but it seems that the person buried at Sutton Hoo may have been the final owner, if we can see that person as actually the kind of possessor of those things. It's possible maybe that some of these objects may have been almost as if they were in some kind of treasury that was for the local community, the local kingdom, for want of a better word. And it may have been something that was kind of seen as everybody's rather than necessarily the person that was buried at Sutton Hoo. But that's sort of slightly speculative, I have to say, because we're not too sure. We don't have written records from this particular period, as I may have mentioned, so we can't always answer some of those questions. So let's find another one here. This is an interesting one. I'm sure many of you are here because you've seen the Dig, the film, the Netflix film that was released earlier this year, and has been a huge success and has, created so much interest in the Sutton Hoo ship burial. And this is from Cleo at Newport News, and she says, how accurate was the story shown in the Dig? Was much added to the story for dramatic effect? Well, it is a film, so quite a lot of dramatic license was used, but they were also very keen to reflect how the excavation looked in very accurate terms. So the way that I kind of describe it is the storyline, the narrative, the relationships between the various people that you see represented in the film. That's where some of the most dramatic license has been kind of applied, shall we say. But the actual representation of the excavation, the way that the ship looks, the tools that were used, the way that the artifacts are displayed in the ground when the excavators are taking them out, and that really wonderful sequence where the discovery is made and they start to remove the artifacts, all of those things are really accurately portrayed. And I sort of claim a slight small tiny hand in that I was one of two people at the museum, together with my colleague Francesca Hillier, who's our archivist, who assisted the filmmakers with their research about the excavation. So we were lucky to welcome the production designer, a lady called Maria Jerkovic, who came to look at many of the hundreds of photographs that we have from 1939 of the excavation in our archive. Really, really full photographic record that shows in lots of detail from lots of different angles how the ship imprint looked in the ground, how the artifacts were found, the kind of orientation of the artifacts in the ground even, and they took that information and really used it beautifully. So one of the things that I was so sort of blown away to see was the purse lid from Sutton Hoo. There's a really beautiful purse lid, again with golden garnets and lots of imagery on the front showing birds of prey and a man standing between creatures, really curious, wonderful imagery. that was found in the ground upside down. So the most beautiful decorative part with all of those wonderful motifs could not be seen when it was excavated. It was sort of rather plain backing. And you would think that any filmmaker might sort of flip that over and just for Hollywood reasons show the decorative side face up, because that makes a slightly more dramatic scene, really, doesn't it? But they didn't do that. They actually stuck to what was found in the ground using our photographs that we hold at the museum, and replicated it even to the degree that these things were shown upside down, which I took my hat off to them, and it was really quite gratifying to see how much they'd stuck to the archival photographs. But moving on to the relationships that you see represented, that's where the sort of dramatic license is used, and the kind of the tensions that were on site at the time in 1939 are really sort of ramped up slightly in the film, I think, to give that dramatic effect, and that's what we'd expect in a film like this, really. So the two characters, Basil Brown and Charles Phillips, that you see in the film kind of butting heads with each other, actually, in real life, we have their diaries at the museum. We know that they actually got on with each other fairly well. There was a sort of initial tension between the pair of them, just simply because I think it was a very stressful time, that nothing like this had ever been discovered before. And there was a difference between these men. They were very, very different men. Charles Phillips was this professional archaeologist, Cambridge educated, didn't suffer fools gladly, shall we say, was fairly no nonsense. And we have Basil Brown, who's a self-taught archaeologist from Suffolk, very different characters, but they buried the hatchet really quickly, and they got on really well with each other, and there's very clear mutual respect in their writings that we have. So I think those sorts of things were ramped up for dramatic effect, but all of the sort of physical aspects of the burial were incredibly accurate. So thank you for that question. Now let's move down here. I've got one from Jean, or Jean, I'm assuming it's Jean, in St. Louis in the US. And if it's Jean, I assume she will be in Iceland in October. Are there helmets of this type on display in Iceland? Not as far as I know, unless there are any replicas there that I don't know about. As I mentioned in the video, these sorts of helmets are very rare, and I might roll this into another question that I spotted somewhere, which was let me see if I can find it. I can't spot it, but somebody, if I find it when I'm scrolling back down during future questions, I will give the name check of the person. But somebody did ask if any other helmets had been found, any other complete helmets had been found along with the Sutton Hoo helmet. Again, the answer is yes and no. So we have around 4 complete helmets that survive from this period that we know of, that are from England. We have a 5th one that was found on the Isle of Wight, so it was found in England, but we think it was probably made in what is now modern day France. So we kind of have 5 helmets from this period. And the Sutton Hoo ship burial helmet is the most elaborate of those. We also have more recently fragments of another helmet that was found as part of the Staffordshire Hoard, and that's been reconstructed. You may have seen the image of that helmet. So that would have been roughly contemporary with the Sutton Hoo burial. But because it's so fragmentary, the reconstruction of that is quite speculative in a number of ways. But it does seem to suggest that there were more of these helmets in circulation, but they still appear to have been incredibly rare. Certainly these metal decorative helmets. I think other people probably would have gone into conflicts wearing some kind of headgear, but probably maybe a reinforced leather or something padded rather than a metal helmet, which does seem to have been rather more unusual. And just again, rolling that into a question here from Tony in Springfield in the US. What was the estimated weight of the helmet? I think I did mention that in the video. We think it was about 2.5 kilos. So quite heavy, certainly for me. I think depending on your strength, it would be rather heavy or a bit lighter for you if you've got a bit more strength about you. So here's one from Gail in Branford in the United States, and this is also another quite common question. And she says, any idea who this person was that was buried at Sutton Hoo? Do we know for sure that the person was a man? I heard that there were women who were important warriors. Well, this is a really key part of current debates. With Sutton Hoo, just talking about the type of person that was buried there, The quality of the grave goods, I think, as I've mentioned in the video, the quantity, just the amount of things that were found in this single grave, and the amount of labour that went into creating the burial as well. You know, it was a really spectacular burial in physical terms. So that we have this 27-metre long ship that's buried inside a huge trench with a vast earth mound over the top of it. The mound probably about 30 metres in diameter, about 3 metres high, built on top of a kind of a high point with a river underneath it. So people going past in the river may have been able to see the profile of these mounds, we think quite possibly. Seems to be somebody who's meant to be remembered, someone who's honoured with this burial in death, whether it's a kind of a status that they held in life or whether it's a status that's awarded to them in death. It certainly seems to be somebody of some importance, and the popular view is that this was somebody who was a king of the local kingdom of East Anglia at the time. So that's the type of person. In terms of whether it was a man or a woman, this is an area of debate that is kind of really growing at the moment. So to sort of try to explain some of the complexities for archaeologists working in this period, when we're working with burial evidence, and particularly these types of burials around the time of Sutton Hoo, when people are buried with what we call grave goods, so with artifacts surrounding them. Usually in the past, it's been the case that burials have been interpreted based on the types of objects that were buried in the grave with the person. So if you have a bunch of weapons, if you have a really big buckle, those are the types of things that were generally interpreted as belonging to a man. And so therefore, those burials would be described as male burials. And women's burials were identified traditionally by lots of dress accessories, so things like lots of brooches, also domestic equipment such as things to do with making textiles, those kinds of weaving equipment, that sort of thing. And so the presence of those artifacts tended to be seen as identifying that person buried in that grave as a woman. Problem is, as scientific techniques have developed and we've been able to biologically sex skeletal remains that are found in these burials, there have been quite a few mismatches, as we would traditionally interpret them, between the type of grave goods that have traditionally been gendered as male or female and actually the biological sex of the burial that's been buried in there. Not too many. For the most part, it seems that where we have a biological sex and we have a kind of gendered grave group, there does seem to be a correlation along those traditional lines, but it's not by any means hard and fast. So there seems to be more instances developing where we're able to apply those scientific techniques, where we're finding, a divergence between what we would traditionally understand between a set of male grave goods and the biological sex of the skeleton. And I think the Gale is perhaps referring to the woman who was discovered in the grave at Birka. Not fairly recently. The grave was actually discovered in the 19th century, but the grave was fairly recently reinterpreted based on scientific analyses of the skeleton as actually belonging to a woman, when previously, because it was such an elaborate warrior style burial with lots of grave goods, lots of weaponry, previously identified as a man. That's dating to the Viking period, so that's a few hundred years after the burial at Sutton Hoo. But we have found women buried with weapons and men buried with, beaded necklaces and things like that from this earlier period, contemporary with Sutton Hoo. So I think that the more that scientific analyses are able to be applied, we're going to find much more of these kinds of finer grained, nuanced instances of differences between the grave goods and the people that were buried with them, which is going to enable us to build a much richer picture, I think, of the populations that we're studying. So that's a really interesting question, and one that I think we're going to be returning to a lot over the coming years with any luck. So let's move down. Lots of questions coming. I'm going to do my best to get through as many of these as I can. So I've seen quite a few questions that are asking about Vikings. So I think I'm going to pick one out. Okay, so I think it was quite an early one. Sorry, bear with me. Lots and lots of questions coming in, which is great. So So no. Oh, right. Yes. So I'll use this one as an example. But if any of others of you have asked about Vikings, then this one is going to sort of try and cover the ones that I've seen. So this one is from Ruthie in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and she has asked, what is your opinion on the portrayal of Vikings wearing horned helmets? Is there any historical evidence of this or any horned helmets which have ever been found? So one of the kind of common misconceptions that you might see when you're sort of Googling Sutton Hoo on the internet is that it's a Viking burial. And I can say it's not a Viking burial. The Sutton Hoo ship burial is in England in the early 7th century. And the Vikings, the Viking period, interesting actually, the research is sort of pushing back the sort of start date of the Viking period even earlier, but this is something that we think is coming in the kind of mid to later 8th century, and certainly in England, the Viking sort of period in England is something that's coming in sort of in the very late 8th century into the 9th and 10th, and even into the 11th century with sort of fluctuations. But I think that Sutton Hoo, because it's a burial in a boat, or in a ship in this case, tends to be kind of equated with the Vikings, because we're used to the Vikings burying their dead in ships. It's something that we see in popular culture, but it's also something that they were actually doing in the kind of 9th and 10th centuries. They are burying their dead in ships in certain parts of Scandinavia and abroad as well. So I think it sometimes sort of the two get conflated, but Sutton Hoo itself is much earlier than what we see when we see the Vikings burying their dead in ships in Scandinavia. But in terms of the horned helmets, there isn't any archaeological evidence really for those horned helmets. That seems to be a sort of fancy that comes about, I think, in the 19th century, where these sorts of images start to come to the fore. So we don't really have any horned helmets that date to the Viking period. What you would have seen, and what I explained on the video, was this sort of horned headgear or some kind of headdress, maybe, that the figures that are depicted on the Sutton Hoo helmet are wearing. That seems to be something that's quite different, and it may be something that inspired those later images of Vikings with horned helmets. I'm not an expert in that particular area, I'm afraid, but it seems to be something that's coming up much later, and sadly so far not something that has been discovered archaeologically. So trying to keep up with your questions. Let's move down and find another one here. So David from Royston in the United States has asked, were any coins found in the burial site? And the answer is yes, they were. There was a group of gold coins that had come from the Frankish region. So again, not from England, but from across the English Channel, from the area of modern day sort of France and Germany, Merovingian coins. And that's because at this point in England, there isn't a sort of developed coinage that's being used as money as we would understand it today. Instead, coins like these gold coins that we find at Sutton Hoo are generally being used for kind of payment by weight rather than by coinage, but also being melted down to make gold artifacts with. So that's how they're kind of using those coins. But the coins at Sutton Hoo are very useful because they're one of the methods by which we're able to date the burial to the early 7th century, because we know the date of the coins, we know when they were made, and that helps us to provide a dating framework for the burial itself. So those are very useful and a very good question. So let's go down. So James from the United States said he did not hear the name of the film that was made. What is it and how may he get to see it? So the film is The Dig, and it is based on a novel by John Preston. So it's a kind of adaptation rather than an original film. And it was released on Netflix in January of this year. So if you've got a Netflix subscription, that's how you can get to see the film. Now let's move down here. So Carol from Heidelberg in Germany has said, I'm very impressed with the gold and garnet designs in both the Sutton Hoo and Staffordshire hoard. Were these items made locally? Well, that's a really excellent question. So yeah, just to explain, if you're not aware of what the Staffordshire hoard is, that's probably the most significant discovery for this early period, this sort of 7th century period, contemporary with Sutton Hoo, that we have had since Sutton Hoo came out of the ground 80 years ago. And it's a hoard, a kind of cache or an assemblage of mainly weapon fittings, sword fittings, that kind of thing, long knife fittings, those kinds of golden garnet metalwork that we saw on the eyebrows of the Sutton Hoo helmet, but also the pommel that you glimpsed briefly in the video. And it's just this huge assemblage of these types of fittings that have been torn off, bent off, or broken off of the original swords. No blades were found in the Staffordshire hoard, just these sort of metal fittings that were removed from them, along with a few other types of artifacts as well. So, for example, a folded up cross, fragments of the helmet, as I mentioned, and a few other bits and pieces as well that are sort of still to be identified, really, sort of slightly mysterious. But what was so useful about the discovery of the Staffordshire hoard was it provided us with a huge new bank of this type of metalwork that we found at Sutton Hoo, that enabled us to make comparisons between the material at Sutton Hoo and what had been found in the Staffordshire hoard, and to start to move towards answers to some of the most mysterious questions that we have for this period. One of which is, what was it like in these metalwork workshops? What were these workshops like? Who were the people that were making this type of metalwork? These are questions that we've always really struggled to answer, because, as I've mentioned, we don't have written records for this early period. They're coming in later, so we don't have their own kind of accounts of what they were doing and how they were doing it. We have to rely on the archaeology and the art that's left behind. But by comparing the way that some of those artifacts from the Staffordshire hoard were made with the artifacts from Sutton Hoo, the artistic motifs that were depicted on both of those assemblages, the way that things had been made, the techniques used to make them, very detailed research was able to find quite close parallels between some of those artifacts in both of those assemblages, and kind of given us new insights into the workshops and the metalworking techniques of this particular period. And it has been shown that it's quite possible that some of the material in the Staffordshire hoard just might have been made in the same workshop as some of the material from the Staffordshire hoard, possibly in that East Anglian area. So it's really, really exciting. The Staffordshire hoard, again, is one of these really, really amazing discoveries that is really high up there with Sutton Hoo. And it just goes to show you that Staffordshire hoard was founded in 2009. Goes to show you that, you know, these sorts of discoveries can still be made, and you know, it's never over. You know, it's never, we've never found everything, we've never learned everything. It's always possible to kind of make new discoveries, and that was discovered by a metal detectorist, you know, by accident in a field. So it just goes to show you that these things are out there, I think, waiting for us to discover them. So yes, just had one come in from David. This is a good question, because this is a really fascinating aspect of the Sutton Hoo burial. So David hasn't said where he's from, but David has asked, had anyone tried to dig into Mound 1 before Basil Brown? And the answer to that is yes, but a long time ago. So one of the things that Basil Brown and his team discovered when they were excavating the ship burial, Mound 1, was they found some pottery inside the mound that dated to the Tudor period, so sort of it looks around the 16th century, something like that. And it appeared to be kind of at the bottom of a shaft that had been dug into the top of the burial mound. And what this suggested was that at some point in the past, somebody, at this point in the sort of Tudor period, somebody or some people had made an attempt on getting inside the mound. They'd dug down so far and they'd decided, for whatever reason, there's nothing here, we're going to give up. They probably had some kind of feast, some kind of meal, had a few drinks, thrown their rubbish into the pit that they'd made, and then off they went. But the reason that that's so kind of spine-tingling is there are lots of other mounds at Sutton Hoo, and all of them that have been excavated have found to have been, or the other large ones around Mound 1 have been found to have been robbed in the past. So Mound 2, which is another burial which also contained a ship burial, was so thoroughly looted when Basil Brown excavated it in 1938 that only small fragments were found. And so we have no idea whether that was on a par with what we have in Mound 1 or was you know, even more magnificent or less magnificent. We just have no idea. It's just sort of glimpses of its former greatness. But the reason that the hapless kind of early discoverers of the Mound 1 ship burial were unlucky was, I think it's actually mentioned in the dig. I think it is referenced in that the mound shape over time had eroded. It had been that land had been farmed during the time between the burial and the discovery in 1939, and so the mound had its shape had changed. So the middle of the mound, which had originally overlaid the middle of the burial chamber, had kind of become slightly off centre because of the way that it had eroded. So the middle of the mound was no longer above the middle of the burial chamber. So if they'd just kept digging, they would have come down eventually onto the corner of the burial mound and may have found what they were looking for. So, you know, it really is just a matter of inches that we actually have the Sutton Hoo ship burial at all. It was that close, you know, really fine margin to it being lost to us forever. And we actually have those fragments of that drinking vessel at the museum, and I find them to be like horror film objects. You know, they're kind of like the most terrifying objects that we have in the collection because they're a reminder of what we almost lost. So it's a really fantastic story, and yeah, so a really good question. So let's move down here and find another question to answer. Oh, so I can speak to this one. I've sort of answered this a little bit with from Philip in the United States. Let's just move back up. Let's move back down. So he says, do you think there are still more archaeological sites yet to be discovered which will be as important as Sutton Hoo? Are there any sites that you know of which are currently being excavated? Well, the answer to that, I'm happy to say again, is yes. So I'll just take a quick sip of water. As I've mentioned with the Staffordshire Hoard, it's always possible that whether by another excavation, an archaeological excavation, or whether probably more likely by metal detectorists, or potentially by building works, in advance of building works, such as Crossrail, the rail infrastructure project in the UK, but also housing developments, that kind of thing. It seems to be, you know, likeliest that those kinds of discoveries might be made along those kinds of lines rather than a kind of archaeological excavation of the type that we have at Sutton Hoo. But there is an excavation going on about, well, there is a project going on investigating a site that's about 5 kilometres north of Sutton Hoo, a place called Rendlesham, which, unless you're sort of an archaeologist, is probably better known for being the site of a UFO sighting back in the day. But there's actually it's actually well known as an important site in the early medieval period. It's mentioned in one of our key texts for this early medieval period, Bede, the Venerable Bede, who many of you may have heard of. And in his work, he describes the site of Rendlesham as being a vicus regius, which is kind of like a royal settlement. And what we think was going on there was that the kings of East Anglia, leading people, were spending time there, may have had a hall there, were possibly doing things like administering justice and hearing cases and holding their feasts and doing other kinds of business while they're there. And that's because we have a very rich assemblage that's coming from this site. It's actually probably the richest settlement site that we have from this early medieval period around contemporary with Sutton Hoo. It also seems to be a site for international trade and exchange at this time. Until it's eclipsed a bit later in the kind of 8th century by Ipswich, which is a nearby kind of port in that region. So it's a really significant site, and metal detectorists have shown a very rich assemblage coming from this particular area. And one of the theories is that this is the settlement site that's related to the burial grounds at Sutton Hoo. So the people that were buried at Sutton Hoo may have been kind of enacting their business at this nearby site of Rendlesham. And one of the really exciting things about the site of Rendlesham is that it's possible that they may have found the remains in the ground of one of these great timber halls. And that kind of sets my heart aflutter a little bit, because in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, as I've mentioned, we have all of that feasting equipment. We also have an extraordinary copper alloy cauldron, which was suspended from a very tall building by means of a very long chain that we have in the burial, an iron chain. And previously, we've kind of been able to estimate the dimensions of that hall based on the height or the length of that chain. And now, quite possibly, we might just have at Rendlesham the remains of the hall. You know, if we take a little speculative leap, that cauldron at Sutton Hoo may have been suspended in. Now that's me speculating because I get excited about it, but I don't think it's completely out of the question that we might have a structure at Rendlesham that the person who is buried at Sutton Hoo may have spent some time in. Now that's active research, so that's a very much watch this space type of thing. So if you're interested, have a Google about Rendlesham and you'll find some information from the people who are running that project online. So I'm going to just quickly answer this one from Jimmy in the United States, because I have touched on it before. What was found in the other burial mounds at Sutton Hoo? Well, many of them had been looted, so unfortunately just fragments of similar types of artifacts that we find from Mound 1, little fragments of metalwork and that kind of thing. But there were some mounds also there that were excavated in a later excavation. There's been a few excavation seasons at Sutton Hoo, and in a later excavation some of the other surrounding mounds were excavated, and one of the key ones that were discovered was a mound that contained the burial of what we think is a male, with his horse and the horse's trappings, you know, really beautiful, elaborate harness trappings that this horse was buried with. And those finds are on permanent display at Sutton Hoo itself. They're British Museum objects, but they're on a long-term loan at Sutton Hoo, run by the National Trust in East Anglia in Suffolk, near the town of Woodbridge. So I should mention that, yes, if you want to visit the burial grounds at Sutton Hoo, check the National Trust's website. Their estate walks around the burial ground have been open during lockdown for local visitors, but now that we're able to move around a little bit, it's possible for other people to visit from out of town as well. But do check their website and make sure, you know, current conditions and that you're following all of the lockdown rules. But if you want to visit the burial site, you can, and eventually their visitor centre will reopen, hopefully as the British Museum will too, and you can see those finds from that mound with the horse and the man buried with him. So let's have a look down here. So I've got a question here from Laura in Columbus in the United States. This is also an excellent question. Were most of the materials for its creation gained through trade, and did the artisans learn their skills from other cultures? Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a mixture of answers to that one, really. So there were pieces in the burial that would have been gained through types of exchange at this time. So I mentioned the garnets. We're not entirely sure what form the garnets that inlay the metalwork would have arrived here in. It's possible that they were traded to some degree ready cut, but I think with the Sutton Hoo material, everything is so kind of bespoke that I think it's probably the case that they were cut to order specifically by the person that made those particular artifacts. But there is an exchange, a kind of trade in garnets going on at the moment that is bringing these stones in some form from the Indian subcontinent, from southern India and from Sri Lanka. It's making its way by various stages across Europe and eventually finding its way into England. And again, this is not, we shouldn't necessarily visualize this as ships that are sailing from India all the way around to England. This is like a network of exchange, like a web of exchange, lots of different routes from those places that are crisscrossing Europe and sort of Central Asia and Asia at this time, and bringing those things in stages by degrees ultimately into England. So there's this kind of process going on at the time. And also, yes, the importance of influence from outside. That's certainly something that we see at Sutton Hoo and just throughout England during this early medieval period as well. We see the absorption of ideas from Scandinavia, from Western Europe, probably even from Eastern Europe itself. So, for example, to take the Sutton Hoo helmet, as I mentioned, that appears to have some kind of model that's come from further east. A set of shoulder clasps as well that were found in the burial. The very form of those clasps is completely unique in the context of England, but the models appear to be much older and from somewhere else. So we see vaguely similar clasps in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Byzantine Empire at this time, and even further afield on the fringes of the Byzantine lands, sort of moving into the steppe region in sort of very far Eastern Europe and moving into kind of Central Asia. These types of ideas are really moving around during this period. You know, this is an island, but it's not an island, so to speak. It's not a cultural island. The seas and the land routes are very active during this period. People, objects, ideas are moving around all the time and influencing each other. You know, this is not somewhere that's previously, I think, you know, in olden times, Sutton Hoo actually helped to change that idea that this is a kind of, you know, an insular place that's sort of very inward looking and not really plugged into the rest of the world. Sutton Hoo shows that that's absolutely not the case. This is you know, a place of really rich ideas that have been drawn from all sorts of different cultures. So again, yes, that's a really interesting question. So lots and lots of questions. I'm sorry if I'm not going to be able to get through. So I see we're running slightly short of time, but I'm going to try and get through a couple more. This is a good one. This is from Doreen in Chicago in the US. And she says, what do you think is the likely impact of new technology on archaeology? Will computer-generated imagery make it easier to do things like piece together the helmet in the future? Yes, I think absolutely. I mean, as I've mentioned, with the scientific techniques that identified the bitumen and have been able to kind of help us to create this more nuanced picture of burial archaeology in terms of the types of people that are being buried with the types of artifacts. Yes, science and technology is one of our greatest hopes for learning more about all sorts of things relating to archaeology. And yes, I think that you know, 3D modeling, those kinds of things, the fact that you can scan all of the fragments of something like the Sutton Hoo helmet and then, you know, try to digitally put them together to create something and find all of those joins, which previously was manually done by hand, I think is, you know, is a huge going to be a huge bonus for us if anything similar is found and wants to be pieced together like that. I mean, as I've mentioned, the creation of the Sutton Hoo helmet reconstruction that you can see, you know, that took an entire year of that conservator's life to create, you know, this painstaking finding of the joins, you know, matching the curvature of those tiny fragments and looking for patterns of corrosion that matched each other across different joins that were sometimes, you know, just millimeters long. Oh, I mean, that would have been just, I can't even imagine how you know, how focused and how difficult it must have been to do that. So I think, yes, technology by far and away is one of our greatest hopes for yeah, just undertaking that kind of work. And also, I think, just before I move on, enabling us to undertake that kind of work without actually risking the artifacts themselves. So if you can kind of scan all of those artifacts and find a way of sort of modeling them without actually having to keep touching and checking the objects, that's one way of, when you've got something so fragile, of you know, giving it a bit of a break and not literally giving it a rest, I should say, and making sure that you're not handling it too much to make sure that it's so, you know, brilliantly preserved as much as it can be. But by the same token, there is no substitute for the real artifacts either. You know, there comes a point when you really have to get to grips with the actual artifacts. You know, the models can only really tell you so much. They're great for visualizing things and doing sorts of work that I've talked about, but that tactile connection with the physical object, its mass, the way that it feels, the way, you know, the weight of it, the mass of it, those kinds of things are also really important when we're studying archaeology. So I think these are complementary methods rather than anything that could replace an older way of doing things. I think there's space for all of these things, and we need to use all of these tools in our arsenal in order to kind of arrive at the richest possible picture that we can of the archaeology. So I think I'm going to try and take a couple more questions, and there's lots of questions coming in still. So I'm going to try and get through a few more. So this one is from Mary in Fremont in the United States. This is a really nice question. Why do you think there were so many mounds at this site? That's a really excellent question. It's difficult to know for certain, but there seems to have been something quite special about this area where the burial ground was made. We know from other archaeological excavations after the 1939 excavations that this site has a long history stretching all the way back into prehistoric times, all the way back to the Neolithic. There were people doing things on this site for thousands of years. So there's something about it. There's something special about this site that eventually inspired the people that started to bury the people in mounds in the early 7th century, that inspired them to put their mounds on that particular site. I should say also that they were not the first burials on site, the mound burials where the ship burial was. There was an earlier cemetery, a few generations earlier than that, so still in this early medieval period, that was discovered when the National Trust were putting in their visitor centre back in around 2000. They discovered another cemetery, I should say a slightly more ordinary cemetery with less less glitzy grave goods, sort of a fairly ordinary flat cemetery with flat graves rather than mound graves of a earlier community in that area. So there was already a significant cemetery on that site when the mound burials went in, and also after the mound burials themselves took place, the site continued to be used. So later in that early medieval period, we find it becoming apparently a site of execution. So there are actually a number of burials there for people that seem to have been executed on the site and buried in graves there. And this importance for the site is something that has great longevity. So there's something special about the site. We do know in this early medieval period that they like to site cemeteries and important mound burials and important other types of burials in close proximity to prehistoric sites. So there are quite a few cemeteries, early medieval cemeteries, where graves have been inserted into much older sort of Bronze Age mound burials as well. So there seems to have been some kind of connection or reverence or interest in those prehistoric periods, which motivated them to site some of their cemeteries around those kinds of areas. And there's actually a whole book about this, about perceptions of the prehistoric by a scholar called Sarah Semple, who's based up at Durham, if you're interested in this kind of thing. And she thinks about and talks about those kinds of reasons why it might have been that in this early medieval period we see a kind of a returning to prehistoric regions and sites in order to add more archaeology, so to speak. So yeah, that's a really good question. But yes, Sutton Hoo itself, really, really long archaeological history. So this is quite an interesting one. This one from David in Royston in the US. Could they determine the person's size as far as height and build by the dimensions of the helmet? The helmet is actually fairly small. In the video, it looks quite big. I think it's slightly a bit of a perspective issue going on there because the helmet is a bit in front of me and I was sort of a bit behind it. So it looks massive, but it's not as big as that. It's actually quite small inside. So it seems that it was sort of worn by somebody who was not, a huge, great big, hulking 7-foot warrior or something like that. It seems to be, somebody who's of sort of quite average size. No human remains, as I might have mentioned in the video, were discovered at Sutton Hoo, but there is this sort of human-sized void inside the burial chamber that's surrounded by artifacts, and from that it seems that they're kind of, I think, I'm trying to remember what the kind of average is, but it's certainly below 6 foot is the average height that's based on kind of analysis of skeletal remains where they survive. So they're not a hugely tall group of people that are buried at Sutton Hoo. I think it seems to be a sort of rather average size, probably not that different to average size in Britain today, I would imagine. One here from Anthony in the Villages in the United States. How can we watch or access your Curator's Corner episodes? Is it a podcast or a link of the British Museum? Yes, so the British Museum has a YouTube channel and there are lots of Curator's Corners. I've done 3 now, but there are lots of others on all sorts of subjects by curators from across the museum, anything that you could ever care to want to learn about. If you go to the British Museum's YouTube channel, you'll be able to find the series for Curator's Corner, and they're all going to be stored in there. So I think I'm going to find one more now because time is moving on. This is a good one. I don't think I can resist this. So there's a couple here that are kind of related. So I'm going to merge them together because this is such an interesting question and one that we haven't touched upon, and I don't think the video really touched upon either. But it's such an important and interesting aspect of the Sutton Hoo ship burial that this is a perfect way, I think, for us to go out this evening. So Nancy in Austin, in the US, has asked, had Christianity reached this area yet, or did the people of that era still worship the old gods? And then Bob in Carlsbad in the United States, ironically, I was in this region of America a couple of years, my last holiday before lockdown, I was in this region of the US. I went through Austin and quite near to Carlsbad, so that's rather nice. But that's not why I'm choosing the question. I'm choosing the question because it's a very interesting question. So Bob in Carlsbad has said, what clues to religion or worldview are indicated by the burial traditions? Right, well, I'm going to take a sip of water because this is a really interesting answer. So, when the Sutton Hoo ship burial took place in the early 7th century, this is right at the period when we're starting to see the arrival of Christianity in the sort of southern and eastern part of England. So, after the period of Roman rule had come to an end in England, in Britain, in the sort of early 5th century, Christianity, which was here at that time, kind of receded from the sort of area that corresponds with England, lowland England, at that time, and the peoples that had settled there and made their communities there from across the North Sea. They are practicing a traditional religion that's a polytheistic religion with many gods. So yes, sort of older gods, and that type of belief system is what we see being used in England during that time, up until the point of Sutton Hoo, when we start to see Christianity, as I've said, start to kind of make headway again in that sort of southern and eastern part of England and percolate throughout the rest of the region, in response to a Christian mission that had arrived in Kent, recorded in 597. Kent. The King of Kent there converts to Christianity, and we start to see Christianity making its way from that kind of point. It tends to start with the king and then eventually sort of filter its way down through into the ordinary people like us. Eventually Christianization, which is a sort of slightly different process to conversion, where Christian beliefs start to become the general practice. That's a process that takes a lot longer. But this is the type of thing that's starting to happen around the time that the Sutton Hoo ship burial goes into the ground. And that has led to questions about what we see when we look at the Sutton Hoo burial. Are we looking at something that is traditional and pre-Christian in the burial rites, or are we looking at something that could have Christian elements? And there are a few things in the burial that have suggested that there could be some Christian elements going on in this burial. They're kind of a bit of a mixed bag in how we interpret them. So the first group that has Christian connotations is silver that has come from the Eastern Mediterranean that I mentioned, that's come from Constantinople. There are a series of small silver dishes that have cross shapes, decoration in the bowl. And there are a pair of spoons that are inscribed with the name Saulos and Paulos in Greek. And those have been in the past interpreted as making a reference to the conversion of Saul and the taking on of the name Paul after he had his vision on the road to Damascus, which is one of the stories in the Bible, which I'm sure many of you would have heard of. But that sort of issue has been rethought in more recent years, because the Greek inscription that spells out the name Paulos is actually not great. It's sort of rather poorly cut, and one of the theories is that maybe the spoon was an attempt by somebody who couldn't read and write Greek to copy the Saulos spoon and just ended up kind of not quite pulling it off. I think that's going to be a question that we're never really going to know the answer to, but that's one of the ideas that relates to possible reflection of Christianity at Sutton Hoo. The other issue with the silver is that the silver has come from a Christian context in the Byzantine Empire. That's a Christian empire at this time, but it's come into a context in England, in East Anglia at this time, which is not completely Christianized at this time. So just because it's made in and was used in a Christian context doesn't mean that those meanings and those functions transferred across its journey and then were used and understood in the same way in England. So the objects move, but their meaning and function doesn't necessarily go with it. So that's an important distinction to make. The other object that's really interesting to think about when it comes to Christianity is the enormous gold buckle that survives from the burial. I wish I could show you a picture, because it's really an amazing work of art, really. So please, after this, go and Google the Great Gold Buckle from Sutton Hoo and you'll be able to see it. But what's fascinating about this buckle is that it's actually also a box. So it opens on a hinge at the back, and it's kind of got a void inside, and you would have been able to put something inside that buckle. There's actually quite a lot of space in there, so you would have been able to put something inside it. And similar types of buckle from this period are known from parts of the continent, from the Western Europe, and where those have been found, they have been found to contain sort of bits of fabric, bits of beeswax, small items that have been interpreted possibly as relics that have come from some kind of Christian shrine. So what we could have here is some kind of buckle-shaped reliquary. And it's just possible that the Sutton Hoo buckle may have been used in that way, but we don't know for certain, because whatever was kept in it didn't survive. So that's, a heartbreaking mystery. But the other interesting thing about the buckle is the decoration. So it's covered in this dense decoration of fierce creatures, birds of prey, serpents, four-legged creatures who are all kind of intertwining with each other and biting themselves in each other. These kinds of what we call zoomorphic motifs we tend to associate with kind of pre-Christian period, because these are the kinds of, the fierce creatures that tend to pop up in mythology as it's recorded later on, birds of prey, that kind of thing. But there's also references in the Bible to creatures that crawl on the earth and that fly in the air and that walk on the ground, that kind of thing. And those are all the types of animals that are represented on the buckle as well. So it's quite possible that iconography, could have had some kind of Christian connotation as well. The issue comes when we try to understand whether that was intended, whether that was baked into the buckle when it was made, that it was intended to be to represent a Christian story, or whether it's something that in the context of Christianization and conversion actually was a sort of an older set of motifs that could be handily reinterpreted in the new Christian way of doing things. So it's something that could be repurposed, renegotiated, rethought, that kind of thing. So it's quite complicated, but you can see how older things could be renewed in a newer context if they happen to kind of have those kinds of useful correspondences between each other. And I happen to think that it's absolutely what we would expect to find in a burial of this period, when there's lots of spiritual experimentation going on, when there's the coexistence of different belief systems that are going to be kind of interacting with each other, influencing each other, changing each other in a way. So the fact that we have these mixed messages in the Sutton Hoo ship burial itself, I think, is something that we would absolutely expect to find in this crucial transitional period between the kind of old ways and the new that's reflected at Sutton Hoo. So it's quite a complicated story, but hopefully I've made I've made it kind of clear enough for you to kind of get an idea of the types of things that are going on in this period, and why it's just so rich and fascinating, and why Sutton Hoo is our kind of almost our best guide to what's going on in this period before we have those written records. So there are lots more questions. Sorry, I haven't been able to get to them all. And I'm just really pleased to have been here with you this evening and presented the video, and to have had such wonderful questions. You're all obviously been very engaged and have asked some really fantastic questions that have enabled me to kind of tell you a little bit more than the video was able to tell you. So thank you very much for your interest and your engagement. So I think all that remains for me to say is, if you'd like to find out more about Sutton Hoo, please visit the British Museum's website. As I've mentioned, our YouTube channel, there's another video there specifically that I've done about the Sutton Hoo swords, if you want to learn more specifically about Sutton Hoo. While the museum remains closed, you can actually undertake a virtual tour of the Sutton Hoo gallery, which you can find via our website, which is a nice way to kind of look in on the treasures while we're still waiting for our sites to reopen. Hopefully, the museum will reopen in May. Obviously, that very much depends on events. So my advice would mainly really be to just keep checking the website. It will, of course, be announced on the website and on our social media channels as well. So just keep abreast of those things, and hopefully we'll be able to welcome you back to the museum at some point in May. And the same also goes for the National Trust site at Sutton Hoo itself. I'm sure they're hoping to open in May when other museums are allowed to open. So keep checking their website if you're interested in going to see the burial ground itself, which I can thoroughly recommend. I think the two halves of the British Museum and of the site at Sutton Hoo kind of form a whole, a sort of a whole together. We're two halves of the same story. So if you're able to visit both, I can thoroughly recommend that. And hopefully that's something that we can all look forward to in happier times ahead. So thank you again for your interest. Thank you for joining me this evening. And good night.